Welcome to this week's podcast with Rob Beyer and Dan McClure. What we're going to be talking about this week is the West and the nature of the good life. So your readings this week are the first through third chapters in Russ Schaefer Landau's The Fundamentals of Ethics. We also have a reading by Brad Hooker called The Elements of Well-Being. And then Richardson's West from Appomattox. The introduction and chapter 1 are your assigned readings for this week. If you want to go a little above and beyond, our recommended and or graduate reading is Patricia Nelson Limerick's The Legacy of Conquest and Susan Wolf's article Happiness and Meaning. So this week we're just kind of talking about some different theories of the good life, and we're really just getting into this whole idea of the West really coming from the Civil War and Reconstruction. And so I'm going to hand it off to Dr. McClure now.
All right, so in Richardson's introduction, we were reading the introduction in chapter 1, where she outlines, really the book's about the formation of this sort of middle class ideology that comes out of the Civil War, and the debate between, the proper relationship between government and its citizens. And her argument is by 1901, the middle class has a worldview that divides the nation into two groups, right? On the one hand, there's hardworking Americans, right? Those who, quote, believe that success came through hard work and that all Americans were working their way up together. And then on the other hand, you have special interests, right? Those who believe that there were fundamental conflicts in society that must be adjusted by the federal government. And this story unfolds across, an era of history. It's especially in like a U.S. survey you would call like Reconstruction or post-Reconstruction. A time when the U.S. government has expanded. Right, it's the first. The Civil War is the first time there's national taxes.
Yeah, unified currency.
And there's now a push for infrastructure across the United States, right? It's the era of, railroads. And so what, part of her argument is, the Reconstruction era is more than just the South, but it's industrialization and urbanization, the ills that come with it. And then the other part too, and this is where, and urbanization and industrialization fits into the game, Red Dead 2.
Absolutely.
But the sort of the quote final defeat, right, of Native Americans, as well as mining companies moving west, right? So we want to look at this era, especially in relation to the game, to this westward expansion that's really being combined with industrial capitalism. A part of the middle class, right, ideology that is unfolding, right, is this sort of segment of American society that is opposed to government activism that promotes, right, quote, the interests of workers, big business, minorities, and certain activist women, right, perceiving their demands as an attempt to advance a view of America as a land of class conflict rather than economic harmony, right? So the middle class ideology wants to sort of have this vision of America with its economic harmony, and it's not a land of conflict. If there is conflict, it's because you have, quote, special interests such as workers. And again, really a big difference between sort of contemporary history of the last 50 to 75 years. The middle class saw big business as sort of a potential threat on the same level as as workers and or minorities and certain activist women, right, as Richardson outlines. So at the same time, they're suggesting that these special interests shouldn't manifest the U.S. government on their behalf. They're also manifesting U.S. government on their behalf, because they see themselves as sort of the rightful voice of American government, while at the same time retaining a vision of America as a land of individualism. And so, the other part of this is sort of, right, this living with contradiction. On the one hand, government shouldn't intervene. On the other hand, if government intervenes, it should be on behalf of this middle class. We can see this extend into the West, where in the West you have rugged individualism, but you couldn't experience rugged individualism without aid from the East.
Yeah.
I think when you're playing Red Dead, it's the canned food, right? The canned food doesn't grow on the trees. It is shipped from the East, let alone infrastructure and those sorts of things. The other part of this, and this comes out of Reconstruction, is this anti-government, right? This anti-government sentiment that spreads from sort of ex-Confederates as they're pushing back against Reconstruction, and it finds voice in the West, especially the mountains. And this is an area, right? Think of just look at Colorado. It's an area that is on the edge. But it's also in conflict with existing Native American groups who are not relinquishing their land as fast as these white settlers would like. Mm-hmm. Conflict erupts. At the same time, you have the federal government that doesn't want to, have expensive wars, and right, we have this. I think it's really the traditional image of the Western film that most people are familiar with. Yeah. Whether it's the U.S. government intervening with settlers, or the settlers struggling against Native Americans, or the U.S. government fighting Native Americans. Right. It's this. It's the classic Hollywood version of the Old West. The other part too is. She goes into chapter 1 and...
Can I ask you a question before we get there? So a thing that I was thinking about, or at least what it seemed to me when I was reading this, is I think it's interesting that the discussion of the middle class block is, I think, the way I read it was this is quite different than how we use that term and think about it today. Is that right? There's obviously some commonalities and similarities, right? A lot of these... middle class, this American middle class are people who, have clerical jobs, pretty good salary, although they're not the most hyper rich of people. And that kind of corresponds to the economic notion, in my mind, of contemporary middle class. But, all of the stuff about, for example, thinking about rejecting the idea of a class conflict and stuff. When I just now think about the economic strata and think about middle class, I don't usually think of that's what all of those people hold, right? Or even this opposition to monopolies and big business. It's kind of is focused there, but maybe not how you might think people now that it would be in that kind of economic middle class hold. Does it make sense to am I getting it right that those are distinct things, this middle class that she's talking about, and how we think about that kind of economic strata now? Are they related but different?
I would say a part of this is the book comes out in I think it's 2009. Yeah. And so the book comes out at, the height of the Great Recession.
I see. Okay.
And then there's these debates about what should the federal government do.
Yeah.
And the federal government, in the end kind of sides with big business, right? Yes. They bail out the companies.
Right. All of the Occupy Wall Street doesn't really go very far.
Yeah. And so this is the beginning of the middle class that defines the 20th century.
Okay.
And you could say that the economic harmony part is based off this idea that if these interests would stay out of the way, then the middle class, which is composed of the clerks, but it's also composed of small business owners.
Yes. Mm-hmm. The professorate.
Yeah, and they're competing, right? They're increasingly it's that they're in a relationship with an industrial capitalism that's creating infrastructure and moving infrastructure along through subsidies, from the federal government. But it's a love-hate relationship because you can now order goods if you own a store.
Yeah.
I think of those stores during this time in Red Dead, you order the goods and they come to the store, and then
got the catalog you flip over.
Yeah, the catalog. And so you can't exist without that infrastructure, but at the same time, these massive companies can also destroy your life, right? So it's sort of it's a sharp edge. Yeah,
I see.
yeah.
Okay, sorry, I just had that. I just thought that was an interesting question. Go ahead, please continue.
And so coming out of the Civil War, right, when you have this, right, really the collapse of white Southerners in the within the slave tradition, and this does pop up in the game, but it is a bit watered down. But but the idea of white supremacy and sort of racism that defines the period, and really what comes out of the Civil War, and when we look at this, we can think of how the big argument is, how did people that didn't own slaves in the South support slavery? Yeah. And slavery itself as a system enabled the creation of the idea that there's equality between white men via race, but not necessarily economics. So economics, you were not equal, but the real important part was equality between white men. And so slavery,
someone you could look down upon.
Yeah, slavery enabled that. And then there's arguments, that go back to the founders, right? Like, you can't have a republic without slavery, because the republic itself has sort of a hierarchy in it, depending on wealthy, poor, but the slave class creates a center of gravity that anchors everything. Right, and so when we think of like white supremacy, the reason why even through today white supremacy still sort of lingers is there's this idea that you might be poor, but you have the same interests as sort of the person that owns this massive internet company, just because you're white. Yeah. Right, and that's sort of that's the specter of U.S. history, right? Like this. That relationship, but the other part too, I think, is the anti-government rhetoric that comes out of the South post-Civil War, where it's the critique against federal intervention during Reconstruction, troops, laws against the South making laws against people of African descent, and that sort of thing, and so. Those ideas also migrate west, because also Southerners are migrating west too. Yeah. But those arguments are definitely convenient within that space, because there's a way to conceptualize, if you're in Wyoming and the federal government doesn't want you to do something, but you own the land or you're adjacent to a part of the land, and it's your right to do what you want. There's no one there. Why is the federal government doing that? Yeah. And again, when Richardson's writing this, published in 2009, these are all those arguments. I think, keep thinking of that, the Bundy standoff and all that. Like, it's all this stuff kind of, it's lingers, right? It lingers in the agency of people today. It's just it might take a different form, but the language sort of remains the same. The other part too is when we think of the market revolution. The market revolution, on the one hand, allows the expansion of small farmers, but on the other hand, it allows big farmers to get even wealthier, which hurts small farmers. But again, that's a part of this whole the conflict. And as we move into the 60s, 1860s and 1870s, you see that conflict spark, especially in Texas, Kansas, right, with populism.
This is maybe a good time to also just kind of add in our ethical theory. And so this week, what we were thinking about were just a couple different theories of the nature of a good life. And obviously, a lot of the sort of preceding information right from history, one way you can think about it is, some of these, certainly like, right, this developing group of a middle class wanting a certain kind of life, right? And so part of that, I think, helps us think about, like, what makes a life a good life? What makes my life a good life? And so our chapters this week covered 3 different things, and our additional reading gave one too. And so I just want to start by talking a little bit about hedonism. So hedonism is the theory that pleasure is either the ultimate or the only important thing in life. And so if I'm judging my life, is it a good life? I say, well, does it have more pleasure than pain? Am I getting more joy out of it? Is it a mostly joyful life? Then maybe my life is good. If it's not, maybe my life is not going so well, right? I guess a couple things to note and think about for hedonism. One thing is, when we hear hedonism, we just get this image in our head, or at least I do, right? Which is, if I heard someone say so-and-so lives a hedonistic lifestyle, my immediate thought would be, like sex, drugs, and rock and roll, like partying, like, sensory pleasure, titillation, that kind of thing, right? But historically, if you go back to like Epicurus, who was an early Greek hedonist, or even just think about it in Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill's time, they were utilitarians that were also hedonists. You don't have to just approach it that way or think about it that way, right? Pleasure could be a good conversation with a loved one, or reading a good book, or listening to classical music, or, right? The pleasures are all kinds of things. In fact, Epicurus thought the most pleasurable state is a contented state free from pain, free from anxiety. And so certainly not like, I'm going to go drink a bunch of wine, right? Thinking about this like ancient Greek or Roman context, but instead like, I'm going to try to just have this contented state. And that is the height, right, of pleasure that I can attain, because then I'm not fearful, I'm not anxious, I'm not having any displeasure or pain about anything, right, emotionally or physically. So Schaefer-Landau gives you a bunch of sort of attractive features of it and some objections. I'm not going to go through all of these here, but if any of you want to discuss this on the discussion board, on the Yellow Dig, on the forums, in the comments below, please feel free to do so. I think one of the most attractive ways to think about hedonism is it's kind of what we want for those we love, right? So you think about people you care about, whether it's a close friend, a sibling, a child, a parent, right? You really love someone. How many times have you heard, I just want you to be happy? Now, people don't always mean that exactly right? They don't mean like no matter what. Like, I want you to be happy. Great, I'll be in the basement doing heroin. They probably don't want that, right? But generally speaking, it is something we care about, and that is a really powerful intuitive pull about hedonism. We talked a lot about, in particular, this idea of an experience machine, but you can also think about it as false happiness as one of the main problems of hedonism. And it's really kind of intuitive. The whole idea is, if I could design my good life, whatever that looks like, just in a plugged-in simulation, right? So what do I want? Do I want to be Superman? Boom, I can make that happen. Do I want to, have cured cancer? Boom, I can make that happen. Do I want to have $1 million? Boom, I can make that happen. Whatever it is, right? The whole idea of experience machine is you could plug in, and it'd be indistinguishable as far as you could tell. From your perspective, it seems real. It is as real as anything ever would seem. But once you plugged in, you would forget that you were ever unplugged. You could design your life however you wanted, and then you're in there for forever, right? You're plugged in forever. But it appears to you that you're living the most pleasurable, most enjoyable, best life that you could imagine. Would you plug in, right? And I think a lot of people want to be hesitant about their say no. I'd love to plug in for a day or two here and there. I don't think I'd want to do it permanently, right? And part of the reason there is this idea that we want our happiness, our joys, to be based on the right kinds of things, to be based on real things. So you don't have to go the experience machine route. Just think of if you have a loved one that you cared about, and they had what they thought was a wonderful life, right? That their colleagues at work respected them, that their partner or partners loved and cared about them, that their friends had high esteem for them. And then you found out that all of those people are like talking behind this person you love's back, right? You can substitute yourself, but some people don't care about themselves as much. So if you knew that the people you love were happy, but their happiness was based on falsehoods, based on lies, would you want that for them? And most people will say, well, of course not, right? I want them to be happy, but I want it to be based on real things. And that gives us some reason to think that hedonism by itself, that pleasure is not the only thing we really care about. We care about it in addition to some other stuff. So we'll maybe come back to theories of the good, but I just thought this is a good time to kind of interject that and be thinking about it. So,
how do you think for like hedonism in terms of early in the game, where it's discussions about they're fleeing Blackwater, but there's this Dutch and Arthur going out, and I think they're going to go meet Micah, and they're talking about like at least the people are safe. We have to get we got to get things lined up. And and they're going through the hardships to get because you got to stick to the plan.
Exactly.
But you're going through the hardships to make sure that we can at least in that part of the chapter he says something like we need money. And then we can buy land, and then we can be free. And so and
then we can kind of be happy, right? So so that one way to think about that is it's sort of against a hedonistic output, just in the sense of if one of the things I really want is autonomy, that might be more than just I want to have pleasant experiences. But there is kind of a thing like we're so tired, we're exhausted, we're cold, right? That early part, you're just traveling through that horrifically cold area. That's just like, man, what I really want right now is a fire and a little bit of rum or whatever it is, right? And so there is definitely something to kind of creature pleasures. And of course, early on in the game, there's the very fun sequence where you're going in to meet, maybe meet Lenny or somebody, and you both end up at the bar, and you're just, right, Arthur ends up getting just terribly drunk and stuff, right? That's, again, hedonism doesn't have to be that, but that could be part of it, right? And so at times the game, I think, does depict the idea that at least for some of the people in the Vanderlyn gang, what they really do want is happiness. What they really do want is just freedom from all of the pain and all of the hardship that they're trying to put behind them. That's very good.
And this is a good segue into as you're moving into chapter 2. And you go across the little creek. And then the wheel breaks, and then you fix the wheel.
That's right.
And then you look up on the mountain.
And
there's 3 Native Americans that eventually you meet up with, obviously down the road in the later chapters. But there is that Hosea talks about they got a raw deal,
how they were mistreated.
Where we're going, which is really the Great Plains. Right, that first area there. They got the raw deal. This land that used to be theirs. And now they're pushed up, into this kind of terrible land. And again, I think, as you're going through Richardson, we're seeing this in terms of
absolutely.
And this begins before the Civil War, where kind of conflict is sparked again, where and this is mostly like when we're thinking Wyoming and Colorado. Between settlers, there's the Sioux. There's an attack on I think it's Fort Laramie. The Sioux are joined by the Cheyennes, 1857, and then by the 1860s, which the Civil War, suddenly there's a war going on alongside the Civil War. And I think within the history of all this layered history, some of the Native American groups are joining, right, the South. And a part of that is the anti-government, right? Like you're fighting the federal government. And at least at this moment, the South is anti-federal government who is, establishing outposts and forts and stuff like that. It doesn't work out in the sense that the South loses. And I do think that the Native American groups
the enemy of my enemy kind of thing.
And it backfires, and there's definitely punishment. She also talks about the Comanches, right, in Texas Rangers, right, sort of the darker, right, the darker story of the Texas Rangers that Chuck Norris isn't in.
That's right.
But they're basically pushing Mexicans, Indians out of this territory. And then the Comanche, right, there's raids on the Santa Fe Trail. I was reading a bit in another book somewhere, but it was, originally the the secessionist government wanted to create this path all the way to California.
Okay.
Right, to have access to a different, to the Pacific.
Sure.
And just, not enough resources. So, again, there's sort of, conflict. And then you get to 1864, at least where we live, right? The Sand Creek Massacre, which is, it's, I've read parts, I think it's in Limerick, where it talks about, it's the Denver governor wanting to make a name, right? And and a part of this, right, is that word exterminate, right? Like, I think Americans forget that the use of the word exterminate is sort of everywhere, especially in the press, right? Like during the gold rush, there was a lot of talk of exterminating, California Native Americans. But Richardson writes, Americans wanted Indians out of their way, but it was not clear how that should be accomplished. Westerners hated Indians and wanted them destroyed. In April 1865, under the headline, quote, "The Indians must be exterminated," the Nevada Daily Territorial Enterprise declared, quote, "The prosperity of the state cannot be retarded by these," quote, plumed riders of the desert," end quote. "They have thrown themselves in front of the advancing giant and must be hurled from his path or crushed. They must be followed with fire and sword until they are thoroughly convinced of the danger as well as the futility of making war upon the whites," end quote. Right? And so it's very,
that's harrowing. So.
And I think the part of the game that, it's in the game, right? Micah sort of is the quote bigot, right, in the game. And you get some in the Lemoyne, but and it's understandable. You can't make a game where you're playing amongst everyone.
That's right.
But at the end of the day, most, the common sense of the time kind of went down this path. This was probably a little bit more hyperbole in the sense that maybe people didn't want to admit that this is what needs to happen right, in polite circles. But, part of this sort of settler colonial momentum is these different groups of people need to be removed for white settlers to create the new homeland, right?
Well, and the other thing that this made me think of, I remember there was a passage where there was this kind of discussion of there was this kind of discussion of, we're gonna take the Indians' land from them, but it's because they didn't use it right, and we're gonna put them over here because that's actually better for them, right? And so there is this idea, I think, of in some way, and this leads to, I think, thinking about preferentialism, which is our second theory of the good life. These are people who are substituting really kind of their own preferences or their own knowledge of what's good for people for their own, right? And one way to think about preferentialism is it's a little farther than hedonism, right? You might have preferences that aren't always so much fun. So, I know, Dan, I know you work out, right? And doing that isn't always so much fun, and it's not always enjoyable, right? You get a good burn, you get exhausted, right? But it's for a good purpose, and you're satisfying a desire that you have, even though it's not always pleasant, right? And so preferentialism is a little more sophisticated as a theory of the good, because it can include pleasure. You can prefer to have a pleasant experience or prefer to mostly avoid pain, but you can get more complex kinds of desires, right? That are beyond just, I want happiness and pleasure, I want to avoid pain. And that, I think, makes sense for us, because for a lot of us, we do say, well, yeah, there are things that I want that I'm willing to put up with stuff, right? So, I just gave the example of working out, but, think about, for both of us, the project of writing a dissertation. It was painful. It took a long time. It was difficult. I revised stuff over and over and over again. I read stuff that was hard, and I kept having to reread it, and I felt inadequate. There's all these things, but I wanted to achieve it, right? And so I'm willing to do all of those things, even though they're not always super pleasant, because I'm satisfying that desire, right? And that is this theory, preferentialism, is your life is good insofar as your desires are satisfied, right? So it's a little more complicated than hedonism. It still has a role for pleasure and pain, but it also allows for some, bigger projects and achievements and things. the thing that I think is really intuitive about this that people like is the sort of combination, I guess I would say, of flexibility and personal authority. Like, I know what I like and you know what you like, right? And so just because I prefer to achieve this desire doesn't mean you have to prefer to achieve it, right? So it's very individualized, and people have their own kind of personal authority. Like, I don't have to listen to what other people say about what I should like, right? I don't have to listen to so-and-so tell me this is the book I should read or the thing I need to pursue painting or whatever. It's really entirely up to me, right? And people find that, I think, very often attractive. There are problems with preferentialism in a number of ways. I mean, one of the most obvious examples is just, getting what you want is distinct from what promotes your good. So again, you might think of it like a weakness of will problem, like maybe what I want to do in a certain case is like smoke a cigarette, but that's not very good for my lungs and my heart and all these other, my functioning as a biological human being. There are other cases where, there are things that promote my good, but I never perhaps wanted them, right? So suppose that, some surprising benefit. I walk outside and there's a beautiful sunset and I was like, oh my God, just experiencing this really benefited me, right? Well, that's not something I wanted. It's not a desire I had was to watch a particularly beautiful sunset at 5:15 in Kansas or whatever. It's a thing that happened, benefited my good, but it didn't satisfy desire, right? And of course, there are people who satisfy desires and then they actually feel like they're worse off and they're unhappy, right? So I didn't feel this exact way about my dissertation, but I did kind of feel empty. And I kind of felt like, what am I going to do next, right? I had this goal.
Yeah, the loss of purpose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Absolutely, right? But there are other people, too, who think this is what I want. I desire this thing, right? And then they get it, and they feel deep regret. That can happen, too, and that should make no sense if preferentialism really is about that your fulfilling desires is equal to the good.
Do you think for the preferentialism, too, it's like, so when we're thinking of, like rhetoric of Indian removal,
sure,
1830
absolutely.
or 1820s, 1830s.
Yeah.
It's because a part of sort of, the autonomy of the white settler is the autonomy to move into land that is already theirs. It just needs to be conquered.
Yeah.
But it's not being conquered. It's being settled.
Yeah. And
the people there, which you would describe as lesser than you because of sort of this evolving notion of race.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because of the authority and autonomy through the ideas of white supremacy in this sense.
Yeah.
That you have an obligation and so you would convince yourself you have an obligation to remove these people and put them on this land. I think there's always this, the language in the documents is we're protecting them, right?
Yes.
We're moving their own good. Yeah, for their own. We're going to move to, and it's literally called Indian country early on, like Oklahoma.
Yeah.
Indian country, like in the old maps.
Yeah. There's a great, this is not like a good history book. There's this book called Boomtown by this journalist who kind of follows basketball but other stuff. And it's about the development of Oklahoma City, but it's also like about how the Thunder moved there from Seattle, and that's a whole thing. But there's a lot of really interesting stuff just about like how Oklahoma City started. And the start of it is this territory that was promised to all of these various Native American tribes after they were kicked out of their own territory. Were said, well, you get this now. And then 150, 80, whatever it is years later, it's like, actually, you don't get that anymore. We're going to come take it too. Right?
Yeah, isn't that the Sooner?
Mm-hmm. That's part of the Sooner. Absolutely.
Fast
driving. Get there early, basically.
Yeah, fast driving.
Yeah.
Covered wagon.
Yeah.
That's
the symbol of the Boomer Sooner.
Yeah.
I think we mentioned this, but my degree is from OU.
Yeah.
Right? And so, there's the Sooner there. And on campus, they have there's a big bronze statue of the Sooner, and he's this guy. He's got, kind of a Western-looking hat. He's got a bag of seeds, right? And that's like a nice way to be like, oh, they were so energetic about getting here. But if you read about it, it's basically people who cheated. Like the whole, not only did they cheat by removing all of the Native Americans that were there, but they also cheated because the government basically said, you can come here at this day and settle, but before then, no one gets to do it. And a bunch of people went right up to the line, so that when it was like, the day starts, they were already there. Yeah. And they were taking stuff, and so they're really not playing fair.
They took stuff from Tom Cruise.
That's right.
Far and away.
That's right. So what I think this leads into, so your question is great. I would think it kind of leads into our third theory, which is an objective list theory, because notice that to say, and this is certainly true, right, of these settlers and the government, how they treated the Native American populations, it's also just true when you think of any kind of paternalism, right, where someone says to you, I know better what you need than you do, right? And we obviously, like many people reject that, but we also recognize it as a place. Like if you know, when you're raising a very small child, you mostly don't want to let your child do literally whatever they want, right? I mean, you have to be paternalistic with like domestic animals. You can't let your cat do whatever they want. They'll go outside and get run over or something, right? So in some sense, there are cases where it makes sense to be protective of people because you know what's best for them. But most of us, especially as adults, reject that from other people, right? We don't want the government telling us what is the best for us. We don't want other people to. Sometimes maybe our doctors do or something like that, right? But generally, we reject it. And so one way to think about in this kind of thing is this would be a rejection of a kind of preferentialism and more like an objective list theory and say, look, the things that are actually good for the Native Americans does not actually include autonomy, right? Does not actually include their particular way of, you know, interacting with the land and like the food that's on the land and the animals that are on the land. The right way to do it is this other way, right? That we have of this kind of this particular kind of agriculture, this particular kind of industrialization or whatever.
In the assumption that the voice has the authority.
That's right.
To impose sort of what should be.
Yes. Yeah. So objective list theories, I mean, that doesn't mean objective list theories are nefarious, of course, but that's one way to think about this interaction. Really, objective list theories are theories that go against both of the earlier theories, right? If you think that hedonism is really about what is pleasurable to me, well, different people find different things pleasurable, so it's certainly very subjective. What are my desires? If a good life is fulfilling my desires, well, I might have totally different desires than you. So it's really subjective, right? Objective list theories basically say lots of these things these other places have are good, right? It is good to achieve your goals. It's good to fulfill your desires mostly. And it's good to be in pleasure and avoid pain mostly. But objective list theories are going to say, but there are other things that are not just what I want or what feels good to me that make a life a good life, right? And so our reader Hooker gives us kind of two tests to use to try to think, should something get on my list? If my objective list, it gives us that sympathy test. If I saw two lives where that's cateris paribus clause, right, all other things being equal, but they're missing one of these things and I feel sympathy, I'm like, that's too bad. That maybe makes me think that's something that's objectively good. Or if I think, if I have two lives that are equal, but if I add one of these things, like friendship, like important knowledge, like autonomy, it makes the life better. That makes me think maybe that also is a reason I think this is objectively good, right? And Hooker's list, Hooker is the writer that we looked at, he includes pleasure, includes significant achievement. So it isn't just that I want my minimal desires fulfilled too, right? I want, I don't know, Italian dressing over ranch dressing or whatever it is, right? Really trivial, minor stuff. But I also maybe want really big picture stuff too. Like I want to, I don't know, people want to have children or own a house or get a degree or achieve an award or whatever, right? And so those might be significant achievements. He suggests important knowledge, right? And so it isn't just, I know way too many little facts about various fictional universes because I read them and I watched them and stuff. And it just has taken up part of my brain that I'm like, why is that there? I could use this for something more important. Yeah. But instead, I remember this jingle from when I was 8 that I will never see again. But it's locked in there, right? In general, if I know a bunch of stuff that is important and broad, he thinks that's more important than trivial than narrow as an objectively good feature of a life. Autonomy. I mean, one of the things that we find so objectionable now in our moment in history about both past and in many cases current ways that people are treated is it's taking their autonomy away from them, right? If I'm taking women's autonomy away from them or, African American people's autonomy away from them, we find that like a deep violation. That suggests that it's...
Or the whole mask thing during the COVID.
Sure. Absolutely.
Yeah, so it's,
people really objected to that removal of their autonomy, right? We bridle with it. He suggests aesthetic appreciation as well as friendship. A really interesting thing, and he thinks friendship is different than significant achievement. A really interesting thing I think is he doesn't actually think being morally good is part of a good life on this view. Because when I look at someone who is a morally bankrupt, morally evil person, he thinks my reaction is not sympathy but blame, right? And that's interesting. And there are people who, disagree. There are various objective list theorists. The Hooker is an example, and these are an example, but one of the controversies about objective list theories is, well, what gets on the list and why? Why is this thing on the list and not this other thing, right? Why isn't living a morally good life on the list? Why does it have to be important knowledge, right? And so there are significant controversies, even among people that think this is the right approach, to what exactly should be on the list. It's a continued area of disagreement and discussion. So I think that mostly wraps it up. I will just briefly mention a couple of terms. You have a sheet it's actually from week 1, and it covers our readings from week 1. So I would go back and take a look at that. It's called the Moral Vocabulary and Reasoning Cheat Sheet. It's kind of like in one 2-page document. It's like the condensed version of the von Kriegstein that you read and the Regan that you read. And so I think that there are a number of things to think about here, and I hope that you find it useful. I'm just going to talk really about maybe 2. I think when we're thinking about objects of evaluation in the game and in history, we're going to be evaluating states of affairs, that is like ways things are in big picture, or even maybe locally. We'll look at actions of specific individuals or organizations. So did Micah do the right thing? Did you as Arthur do the right thing, right? We'll also look at the motivations. Why did Arthur do this? Why did Dutch do this, right? And we can do this in terms of organizations, right? We can say the things the Pinkertons did were awful or something, right? We also want to use these general concepts of evaluation. You're not going to get graded if you don't use this language, but it's really helpful to kind of parse out and map the conceptual territory. So you might think something's morally obligatory if you're required to do it, and not doing it means you've failed in a moral way, you've done something immoral. It's kind of the flip side of morally forbidden. You're not supposed to do it, right? Moral supererogatory, we're probably not going to talk about that a ton, although it'll come up when we get to utilitarianism and maybe some of these examples that we think about in the game. A supererogatory action is usually something that is morally laudable, but you're not required to do. So the kind of classic examples are, a person, jumping on a grenade to save the other people they're with. Most of the time we wouldn't say everyone is obliged to do that, and if you don't do it, you failed. But when people do that, we think that's an incredible sacrifice and really morally laudatory, right? A lot of people think of charity as that kind of thing, right? If I'm well off and I give to charity, it's not required, but it's a good thing that I did it, right? And we'll see utilitarianism, a form of consequentialism, actually basically has almost no room for the category of the supererogatory, which is really interesting. And then if something is morally permissible, it just means it's not morally forbidden. You're not required, and it might not even be morally laudatory, but you're allowed to do it, right? So, I made the trivial decision earlier, right, about my preference for Italian dressing over French dressing or ranch or whatever. Probably it's morally permissible. I'm not obliged to do it. I'm not doing something laudable. No one's like, oh my God, you amazing person for having Italian, but I'm allowed to. Don't do anything wrong, right? And one of the claims that is really, I think, fundamental for our discussion, but can be really tricky, so I want to just spend a little bit of time on it, is the distinction between normative and descriptive claims. So the basic idea here is a descriptive claim is just supposed to describe the way the world is. Now, of course, we know that things that look descriptive can hide, right, judgments, they can hide things, or there are implicit things going on sometimes. But generally speaking, if I say, there are 2 people in the room doing this podcast, that's a descriptive claim. I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing. If I said, 2 is not enough, or 2 is one too many, right, then I'm making a judgment. But if I'm just describing it, that's a descriptive claim. And we're going to have a lot of that, both in history but in the game as well. And then our normative claims, that's going to be the stuff where we're really kind of getting into like moral evaluation, but other kinds of norms too, right? So if I say such and such argument is a really poor argument, I'm making an evaluative claim or a normative claim. It doesn't meet some kind of standard. Or if I say, Arthur's action is immoral, or Dutch did the right thing, or whatever, those are normative claims, right? Because they go beyond describing the way things are to, does it meet a standard? Am I making an evaluation? Am I making a judgment, right? And I think the tricky part here is sometimes people think of these and they think like, they will say things like, so normative claims are just things that people have differences of opinion on or something, right? And I understand that way of thinking, right? You're thinking, I think such and such is wrong and you think it's not, so we have a different disagreement and that's why it's a normative or something. But, you might note that like people disagree on descriptive claims too, right? There are people who disagree about, to use some silly examples like whether the earth is flat or not, or whether the moon landing ever happened, or whether there's a secret society of lizard people running the world or whatever, right? Those are descriptive claims, but people disagree about them. And so the mere presence of disagreement isn't going to be enough to tell whether something's normative or descriptive. Those normative claims, just as the matter of just their form, usually involve this kind of a judgment or like a standard that's trying to meet. A really good question that Dan and I have talked about a little bit is, well, what sort of makes something normative? When does it have that force? Is there about a bunch of social inertia, right? And so one way we could think about the normative claims is there might be deep disagreement over whether any given normative claim is binding or how it becomes binding or persuasive to people. But if we're just thinking about how we classify the different claims, it's really kind of just a function of what kind of language is being used. And so if my language is the language of like judgment and the language of a standard not being met, often moral, especially in this class, but we might do some other stuff, right? We might talk about whether in aesthetic judgment, Red Dead is a good game or not. What are the flaws of it, right? And that would be kind of a normative claim. Whereas if we say Red Dead took 8 years to produce and it takes up this much memory, those are going to be like descriptive claims. Mm-hmm. So this is really tricky. And if you're like, I'm not sure about that, just stay with us. We're going to keep talking about it throughout the semester. And it's going to be, I think, important and useful, partly because sometimes people move from one to the other in a way that you can't, right? So, if I just describe a bunch of facts about the world, that by itself is almost never going to get me to a normative claim. I've got to have an extra normative claim in there, right? So I can describe I can describe conditions that slaves went through, right? But it's only when I have the normative claim, like no person ought to be treated that way or something, am I going to get to, and that's why slavery is wrong or something, right? And so part of the way to think about this too, I think, is when we're thinking about, and Schaefer-Land is going to go through lots of arguments. When we think about those arguments that are moral arguments, if I have a normative claim at the bottom, like such and such is wrong, there's going to have to be some normative stuff at the top. Descriptive stuff by itself isn't going to get us there. So,
yeah, and could you say that there's an assertive element to the normative claim?
Absolutely, yeah.
So it's describe, assert.
Yeah. And in particular, like assert something about, that involves some kind of like, I would describe it as like a substantive judgment, right? Mm-hmm. So we can make other comparative judgments like this person is taller than this person, but that's probably not really normative, right? But if we said like,
describing
what Arthur did was
restaurants.
wrong. Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead. What were you
describing restaurants and then making the normative claim of, well, this restaurant's fine and they serve the same food, but this restaurant over here is better.
Yeah, that's right. You might use those descriptive claims to do it, right? You might say, well, look, this sauce has better herbs, or it's more, it's like homemade or something, right? But still, even after you do all that, you need something like more herbs makes a better sauce, or homemade food tastes better, or whatever it is, to then link this is a better restaurant, right? So yeah, most of our arguments are going to be combinations of those descriptive claims and normative claims, so that then our conclusion, if our conclusion is normative. So yeah.
All right. Well, that's week 2.
That's right. We look forward to seeing you again for week 3. If you have any questions, please feel free to email us or drop a comment down below.
All right. See you next time.